thank you to everybody who's come out tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people in the audience here to listen to our candidates speak to issues that are very pressing to our community. I just want to take a couple of minutes to let you know about the format of tonight's debate and also introduce you to our candidates. So on my far right, we have McKenna from the Liberal Party. In the middle is Dewar, the incumbent in this riding from the NDP. And immediately next to me, Milroy from the Green Party. You might notice there's an empty chair at the end, which was reserved for Conservative Party candidates. So I'm just going to put out one final call. Any Conservative Party candidates in the audience who want to come up and speak? Going once, going twice. All right then. It's our democratic process at work. So, the format of tonight's debate, I'm going to be fairly Jacqueline authoritarian about it because we want to get through this in an hour. We want to make sure there's time for the candidates to answer questions as well as to take questions from the floor. So there will be two rounds. The first round are scripted questions that come from our sponsoring organizations. You all know who they are. The AIDS Committee of Ottawa, Qais, the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, Gender Mosaic, the One World Film Festival, and of course the 10 Oaks Project. I've been asked by Jeremy from Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity to plug their federal election survey, which you can get on their website. If you want additional information leading up to the election. I will pose a question. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer that question. Once we finish that first round, we will be taking questions from the floor. I'll let you know when we hit the last question, so you can start lining up at the mics. If you do want to pose a question from the floor, you're welcome to pose it en français ou en anglais. But I am going to ask you to keep that question to 1 minute and to direct it to one candidate. Each candidate will then have 1 minute to respond to your question. When we're finished with the questions from the floor, then I will invite our three candidates to each take 3 minutes for closing remarks. All right, so without further ado then, let's get to debating. So the first question then has to do with homeless youth. So we know that between 30 and 40% of homeless youth come from the LGBTQ community. Obviously, this number is hugely disproportionate and suggests that we're facing a crisis for LGBTQ youth in this country. What steps would your party take to initiate a national action strategy to address the youth homelessness crisis in Canada? And Catherine, we'll start with you. Thank you.
So thank you for having me here. I'm really excited. So obviously this is a really huge problem, and I'm a new candidate here. Hopefully I've met some of you. I haven't met all of you. And with my team, we've knocked on like 70,000 doors in this riding. Homelessness, questions around social housing, very unsafe housing, very difficult arrangements is a huge issue. And when you look at the stats, I was looking at the stats before I came here tonight, looking at LGBTQ youth, and when you look at it, it's so glaring that we have a massive problem with homelessness. And I mean, obviously it's a multi-pronged strategy, so I can talk specifically about what the Liberal Party is going to do, and I'll talk a little bit more about some other ways we can deal with it. I mean, we have committed $20 billion to what we call social infrastructure, and that includes affordable housing and social housing. So that's something that is really key, working with really great organizations like the Youth Services Bureau to look at different strategies as to how we can address very specific problems around homelessness with LGBTQ youth. And it's a very specific problem. I have met with a number of the organizations who work on this issue, and there is no one size fits all strategy when it comes to this. And I think, there are related issues, and I'd like to bring this up as we kind of go along, that homelessness, poverty, discrimination, Then you can lay on race and all these other factors can have a huge impact. And I think we need to be looking beyond just sort of like, the immediate fixes and work in a more, in a more, I don't know, sophisticated is the right way, but in a more comprehensive way to address these issues, in particular with the civil society groups. Many of you are with them in this room, and I think that's the only way we can properly tackle it.
Thank you, Catherine. Paul.
Well, first thing we need, and we've been pushing for this with the NDP for years, is a national housing strategy. We have to have a comprehensive housing strategy in this country. We're the only G7 country without one. So that's the first point. The second point is, just along the lines of what Catherine was saying, we would inject money right away to build affordable housing. So we're talking about 10,000 units within the first year and get that moving. And then subsequent years after, build in stable funding, because if you're going to have a national housing strategy, you better have funding for it after. We've seen what happens when governments put money in, take it out. You get this whiplash kind of scenario, and that's not good enough when you're talking about trying to help certain groups. And so, First Nations, Aboriginal, Inuit, but also when you're looking at youth, LGBTQ youth, you have to have those services there. So all of us now know, I think, hopefully, that it's not just about the roof over one's head, and that's important. It's about the services we provide. So what we all know is supportive housing. There's some great models out there, but frankly, they're just getting by. I think of some of the Options by Town. I remember years ago my father being a founding member of that, which was a great idea to help people who were dealing with substance issues and precarious housing. That was great, but you know what? We haven't grown from those models. We need to grow from those models and actually understand who we're serving. And when you look at LGBTQ youth, they're not being served, they're couch surfing, etc. So we need to help them. And finally, something I was very proud of, Mr. Mulcair announced a couple of weeks ago, is getting the federal government back in the health care business again and injecting money into mental health services and targeting youth. We have to do that. So it's about housing, it's about support.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for actually running under time.
Can I thank?
No, it's done now. Too late.
We're sharing the mic.
Yes, we're sharing the
Yes,
mic.
so we probably don't need the cards because you can just yank the mic
Right,
back
that's
whenever
true.
you're ready. So that's all good. That's all great. Well, thank you for your kind welcome, and I would like also just to take a second before I answer the question to say that I actually was in an event with Elizabeth May earlier this week, and she wanted me to pass along, and I told her we were attending this particular event. She wanted me to pass along her best, and also she told me to do this, which I think was something she did last night in the debate. So peace, love, and understanding from Elizabeth May is what I understand. The Green Party has a robust national housing strategy, as do the other parties. I'm going to leave the details for that particular plan alone, because I think what it comes down to is engaging the communities themselves. The communities themselves know exactly what they need, where they need it, and how much they need. And I think that's the crux of the Green Party platform this election, is that we wish to engage locally, and to do that requires leadership at the federal level, to engage the provinces, of course, for healthcare reasons and also for housing. But in addition to that, the cities also need support in their housing efforts. As you know, social housing in this country is, the federal government of Canada is getting out of the social housing business. And it's going to be a catastrophe for the cities. By 2040, the feds want to get social housing contribution down to 0. And this is the city of Ottawa is putting up its hands in surrender, saying we definitely need help on this particular front. So Greens are anxious to engage both locally and provincially to try and assist in those particular areas, healthcare, mental health, also in housing, and for guaranteed livable income, which is the only party, is the Green Party, to have mentioned that particular item. So that's where we're at with that. Thanks.
Thank you. much-needed discrimination protections for transgender people died in the Senate this past spring. What would your party do to revive Bill C-279 and ensure protections for transgendered identified people in this country? Paul, we'll start with you.
Well, since it was our bill, we would bring it back, and we would get it passed. And we would make sure it becomes law. Look, it's really important people understand that when we're talking about rights, that rights have to be put into law. They have to be protected. Rights aren't something that you just put out as a suggestion. They have to be codified. And this is why the bill was brought forward by my colleague. And it was really, really sad to see this bill die in the Senate. There were so many people behind this bill. I mean, many people in this room. And it got people excited, and it was a solidarity project. And it wasn't just about my colleague who brought it forward. Randall was working with everyone to get this done. And it was an incredible expression of solidarity. And we actually had conservative members behind it. That was something. That was a miracle. It was great. But then we went to the Senate, and we know what happened. But let me just use the rest of my time to say this. Those of you who have been working on these issues for so long, you need to be hopeful still, because that bill was passed through Parliament. You educated so many people. That they can't take away. That is here to stay, and this is going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So, I always say to people after, you sometimes lose these things, and I'm used to it, in Parliament, don't give up, because these things are going to happen. It's too important, and we would make sure it is law, and then to share this with other countries as best practices as part of our foreign policy.
Well, existing legislation and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms do prohibit discrimination. However, we've got to be vigilant to ensure that these laws are respected in practice and in delivery. Obviously, the failure to pass, the gutted version of Bill C-279 is a concern for the Greens. But we pledge to support the reintroduction of a strongly worded and world-class version of this particular bill. I think something else needs to be mentioned too. Again, Paul mentioned the collaboration required to get this thing done initially in its initial stages, and that the Conservatives did participate to some extent in getting that through. So there is hope then. However, we're concerned about the level of consultation and collaboration that's gone on in this country in the last 10 years. We have an empty chair down here at the end, and all kidding aside, that's not very good for our democracy. It's fundamental that the candidates have a chance to engage Canadians at events just like this. And so, all kidding aside, yeah, it's an empty chair and it's sort of laughable, but by the same token, it's pretty scary when you think about the governing party of the day not taking the opportunity to engage Canadians and to listen to you. He might have gotten skewered tonight, I get it, okay? He has to represent a party whose behavior has been particularly bad over the last 10 years. But he's a big boy and he's signed up to do this. So I'm a bit disappointed, and as you can tell, I'm a bit passionate about this because it's a missed opportunity. And so do they deserve our votes, or do they deserve our support in any way, shape, or form because of this bad behavior? And I think not. And we need to get out there and spread the message that this is just not acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Catherine?
I think it's appropriate that you started talking about Canada, thinking that we're a beacon, for human rights around the world. In my background, I'm a social justice lawyer, and I started an organization that does work in developing countries and promoting human rights. And now we work with Aboriginal communities here. But it's amazing to think how far we've fallen. So it was 1969 where Pierre Trudeau just decriminalized, it was Pierre Trudeau's government that decriminalized homosexuality, and we increasingly made advances. We enshrined equality rights in the Charter. We eliminated, sexual orientation was listed as a prohibited grounds for discrimination. We brought in same-sex marriage, and obviously this is the next step. There's still so much work to be done. And when we think about Bill C-279 and trans rights, I mean, that really is, the next way we need to be going. And we were in agreement. We were thinking that we actually had this bill. It was going to go forward. It was a great initiative by the NDP. And then it totally got bastardized by the Conservatives in the Senate. And, it's just so unacceptable that, and you know what, in a very horrible way, it was, there were all sorts of, names called, and this isn't a Canadian way. I mean, Canadians value their charter. We believe in equality. We're against discrimination, and we need to be thinking about, there are still vulnerable groups here, and trans rights, people that are trans, is extremely difficult, and we need to be protecting them and standing up for them. And I hope that we get a new government. We need a new government because we need to be passing legislation, but it's not just legislation, and I'm a lawyer, I love legislation, I can talk to you to death about legislation, but it's also about implementation. It's also about attitudes. It's also about how we see ourselves. And I think, this empty chair here is just so indicative about the inability to have an adult conversation about very, very difficult, issues, but critically important to our society. Thank you.
Moving on to international issues. We've witnessed a rise in legislation in many countries such as Russia and Nigeria aimed at removing human rights protections for sexual minorities. In addition, sexual minorities in many other countries often face state-sanctioned discrimination, hate crimes, violence, and even death. We live in a world in which Canada needs to be opening its borders to refugees and asylum seekers who face imprisonment, torture, and death in their own countries solely on the basis of their sexual orientation. What will your party do to ensure that Canada's borders remain open to LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers? We'll start with Tom.
Thank you. It's becoming Fortress Canada to a certain extent, and the effort to bring and Syrian refugees, this hasn't happened overnight. I mean, it's come to our attention fairly brutally and quickly, but this has been occurring for many months. There are many groups who wish to sponsor refugees into this particular country, and they're not being allowed to do so because of the red tape that's involved. The money required to bring refugee families in is quite extensive. It's quite costly to do so, but groups are still coming up with the dough. The additional thing is they've found accommodation, food, and so forth for families to come over. The holdup is at the Fed end, and that needs to absolutely stop. As far as Canada's role globally, and I can speak to this a little bit because of my profession, one of my roles in my profession is to recruit and place international peacekeeping trainers in various countries around the world. And Canada has a very strong and very hardy reputation with regard to the expertise that we can offer as peacekeepers around the world. And our expertise and tradition is sought after. However, our own government does not assist us in any way to do this type of activity. They have decided to get out of the peacekeeping business, as it were, so therefore we can't take forward to other countries as peacekeepers. We cannot take forward LGBTQ issues, we cannot take forward gender issues, we cannot take forward Canadian values to a certain extent to other nations when we're doing peacekeeping training. And I think that's a very good indicator of what's been happening, and a Green government will reinvest in our reputation in the world. It took 140 years to develop the reputation we have around the world. It only took 10 years to pretty much destroy it.
It actually in some ways is a bit of a technical issue in the sense that, the way we allow in refugees is a little bit convoluted. But right now we have a real problem that actually the Liberal Party, I'm quite proud, addressed today. So we made an announcement, I don't know if many of you heard, about immigration and refugee reforms. A lot of the focus was on bringing in family members, but embedded in that was reforms to how we make determinations about refugees. And this is really important because right now there are countries that are considered safe countries. So if you were to apply for refugee status and you had been persecuted, you had been, beaten, you had been threatened with death, and you happened to be, because of your sexual orientation, you were from a particular country, you wouldn't even be allowed to apply. The minister had discretion to determine these countries, and often these were subject to trade deals. You'd be kind of doing a deal, and you'd be like, okay, country X, don't worry, we'll put you on the safe list, which means that no one from your country can apply to be a refugee for whatever reason at all. And so today what we said is that shouldn't be the process. We actually have to have a proper process where we assess refugees on their merits, and we can actually see if there's a real threat of persecution. And so this will make a huge difference, because we know, I lived in Indonesia, in some of the provinces, Aceh, you could be beaten to death, and you were beaten to death if you were gay. You couldn't talk about it, and it would happen, the police wouldn't protect you. So we know that this is an issue. So whether or not your country was a so-called safe country, you weren't safe. And that's what it should be about, and that's a very Canadian value that we let in people, because, we are an open country, we believe that we need to protect human rights, and we should be letting people in whose human rights are being violated, not just because they came from a so-called safe country. So this will make an actual really huge practical difference.
It really does have to change, and I want to just touch on a couple of things that have happened here locally that are really important, and then talk about international affairs. I was a very good friend of Nicole Laviolette, a very dear friend of many in the community, and she just died recently, but she left an incredible legacy, and that was the Capital Rainbow Refuge. And she and a tireless group of lawyers and activists were able to bring into our community 2 lesbian women, 2 gay men. 2 women were from South Asia and 2 men were from the Middle East. And at Nicole's funeral, I met the 2 men, and it was incredible. It was a Canadian story. They had to, you can't imagine, and we've all traveled, what it is like, and you know the stories, to be gay, lesbian, or trans in most of the world. If you are gay in Russia, or lesbian in Russia, or trans in Russia, and you come out, you're putting your life in your hands. So we've seen what can happen. This grassroots organization is doing such amazing work. And what we need to see is inspire to the top so that it becomes part of the norm. So we have a couple of people who have made it through. And it was really, really hard to get them here. But we know it's possible. And so we're going to make sure that that's part of what we do in our refugee policy, that we welcome those who are fleeing persecution. And it's in the tradition of our country. It is in our values. That's how we got to where we are as a country. So absolutely put this into our refugee protection policy, and at the UN, bring forward this issue at the Human Rights Council and take it to the top, because that's where it belongs. Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
You do it again if you'd like.
No favoritism for my part here. Moving on to the arts then. The Year We Thought About Love, the film we just watched, illustrates the importance of youth arts groups that raise awareness about diversity in schools. Landfill Harmonic, coming up after the debate, is about providing youth from lower income neighborhoods with equal opportunities to learn and play music, and how that contributes to social change. How will your party support the arts and equal access to education through the arts for students of all economic backgrounds, especially those in the LGBTQ communities? And sorry, I lost track. We're starting. Yes.
So we just made a really big announcement this week about funding for the arts. The arts is critically important. I mean, it's not just for the LGBTQ community, although, I mean, there are amazing artists in this room, but investing in arts is a way of expressing yourselves. And if you're someone who, for whatever reason, has difficulty expressing yourself because you feel like you can't be yourself, it makes a huge difference. And, I have a really good friend, and I actually didn't know she was gay. I went to a Catholic high school. Catholic Catholic high schools are brutal for a number of reasons. I don't know if you have to wear kilts, but beyond that, it's very hard to be yourself, and high school is really hard. And she would draw. She was just an awesome artist, and I didn't really understand why she spent all this time drawing, and it was only later on that she told me that was the only way that she could express herself. She couldn't talk to anyone. She couldn't talk to her parents. She didn't even feel like she could talk to me, and I felt like I was someone who was pretty open. And so it's really important that we support the arts for a variety of reasons, but also because, it is such an important way of expressing yourselves, and there's so many great programs that have been shown to have having such a great impact for youth that are struggling with identity, they're struggling with persecution, they're bullied. We certainly are committed to supporting that. We've made major investment in the arts. Through many of those programs, we would be able to access money, whether it's through film, whether it's through, there's all sorts of different media. And I think that's really critical. That's something that I'm certainly committed to. I'm running to be the Member of Parliament Ottawa Centre, and I will be fighting for arts money for programs for youth. And it's not just the LGBTQ community. I was at the mosque. They were talking to me that they need arts programs. And there are so many different communities that it would actually make a real difference. And so that is a really huge priority for both the party and also for me.
One of the most important parts of our lives is actually having meaning in our lives, and the arts do that. I've challenged people to go a day without the arts. I challenge anyone. Good luck. But we don't value it. And I had an arts summit a couple of years ago and came up with some ideas that actually got into our party's platform and really important things like income averaging for artists, because artists don't always make a lot of money, and turns out the times that you do, there's the hand going out from the tax man and say pay it up. So income averaging is a very smart thing to do. But I think right to your question is looking at how the Canada Council funds smaller projects, making sure that it gets down to the grassroots. Some of the best work that's been done in this city isn't at the National Arts Centre, nothing against it, but it's at the Saw Gallery. It's about film collectives. It's about people who just come together with a couple of instruments to make things happen. It's about the festivals we've just had in our community on Somerset, and I also think that if you give people access to the arts, particularly in communities that have been isolated, it allows them to express themselves, to be seen, to be heard, and to count. And if you are able to do that at the grassroots level, then we'll see more confidence. But while we're on the subject, I think we all are in a state of shock of what's happened in our own community and what happened to the mural at Bank in Somerset. It is not okay, it is not right, and we have to stand up when art is being used as a political voice and then people abuse that. I happen to have been passing by after the mural was painted over by people to give respect to it. And I witnessed someone throwing red paint on it. Sadly, I couldn't identify the person. But it's not okay. We are better than that. And we have to make sure the arts are there for everyone, respected, so everyone's voice is respected.
I'm originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and my business takes me back to Winnipeg now and then. Over the years, I have recognized that the Winnipeg arts community is one of the most vibrant and robust in the country. The music community, the theater groups in particular, and the arts are very strong in Winnipeg. And I started to wonder why that was. It's in the middle of the country, I get it, and a lot of people sort of end up gravitating there, but it's because it's an affordable city. Winnipeg arts community is vibrant because the cost of living is not that bad compared to other major Canadian cities. Housing and food are fairly cheap. So artists from around Canada do end up coming to Winnipeg and end up staying in Winnipeg despite, the weather and the bugs. But the idea here is, and my point is this, is that the Green Party is interested in developing a guaranteed livable income for all Canadians. And that will be dependent on how much you get, will be dependent upon where you live and where you're trying to live. So imagine if we can make living more affordable, housing more affordable, and food more affordable for you, and you're able to practice your art anywhere you wish, and not just Winnipeg, for example. The Greens support public education to end prejudice and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity as well. There's no doubt that the film that we saw earlier this evening, and kudos, by the way, to One World Film, it was a terrific film, and that needs to get out into the community in a big way. We need to have more of that kind of interchange in our education system. Thank you very much.
So this next question will start with Paul. In Canada, people living with HIV can be charged with criminal offenses if they do not disclose their HIV status to sexual partners before they have sex that poses what's vaguely defined as a significant risk of HIV transmission. To date, at least 140 people have been criminally charged under this legislation for allegedly failing to expose their HIV-positive status to a sexual partner. What will your party do to end the criminalization of HIV in this country?
Well, as you know, this has been an issue for a number of years, and while you mentioned the stats on it, you know, it's really important that we don't criminalize people's status, and we've been doing that for a very long time. But we also have to take into account, and it is sensitive, times in which there might have been abuse of power, but not in the ways that we, just let me rephrase that, when you look at people's status and the way it's being criminalized, what has been forgotten in the criminal courts is that the vulnerabilities that people have when they are HIV positive. What I'm talking about, and many of you will know this, is that the stigma that goes with being positive and not being understood or accepted means that we're actually driving people down. And it means that people aren't able to be open as what their status is. So there's two parts to this. I think it's really important not to criminalize your status the way it's been done. But we also have to do a massive education program in this country about what it means. Even, I'm sorry to say it, but in 2015, a lot of people still don't know what it means to be HIV positive and how you can live and how it isn't something that is going to affect the people around, that people have to be able to live full lives. So we have to take this out of the criminal courts, if you will, and put this where it belongs, and that's in the public domain, to say we need to respect each other, we need to understand each other, and not criminalize status because it isn't working. It's just not working.
Greens are very interested in removing that particular aspect from the criminal code. In addition to that, we also believe that education is key with regard to transmission of HIV, and the government should be taking a leadership role in that particular area. However, again, I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that requires a sensitive touch and consultation and communication at a very sophisticated level, at a level that we haven't seen in 10 years. And again, I have to go back to the inability of the Canadian government to consult or collaborate with anybody in this country. They haven't been able to discuss anything with the premiers in almost 10 years. They haven't discussed anything with First Nations in 10 years. They haven't discussed healthcare issues or the improvement of healthcare in this country for 10 years. So who are they talking to? I don't know. I have no idea. Perhaps themselves and Energy East, maybe, I don't know. But something fundamental needs to change. What we're talking about here are sensitive issues with regard to decriminalizing that particular part of the criminal code. And it's not going to happen unless we develop better skills at consultation, collaboration, and getting out and discussing this with the communities that are affected the most.
Thank
as Paul was saying, this is obviously there are going to be situations where there are problems. We have seen a couple situations like that, but this is where you have discretion of judges. You don't criminalize this particular behavior. What you do, we already have provisions in our criminal code most of the time. Every time I love it, the conservatives come out and they go like, we just thought of a new crime. We've got it. You know what? There's this obscure thing that we could legislate. Super lame. It's also just wrong. It's the worst approach to a criminal justice system ever. And the reality is there are going to be situations, and they will point, this is what happens to the chair here, they would point to the most extreme version of the situation and say, you know what, this is why we have to legislate, because your children are going to be unsafe, and they're going to get transmitted HIV, and it's going to be all terrible, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is, we already have laws. So in this situation, decriminalize and give judges the ability to actually do the flipping job, which is actually determine what a particular sentence should be in a particular case. Sometimes, it has, there is, particular situations, we said, as Paul said, vulnerable people, where it can be an issue. Sometimes it's an educational thing, but it's really up to a judge. The judge can identify, can listen to the circumstances, and then actually come with appropriate punishment or appropriate means. I think I did answer the question.
Keep comments from the audience, thank you. There will be an opportunity for comments from the audience later. Please continue, Ghanem.
I think I sort of said my piece.
The final question, so I'll invite people to come to the microphones as we're asking this question, so we can be prepared to go into questions from the floor. Paul mentioned the mural to murdered trans feminine women of color that's been vandalized twice since it was unveiled during Pride, which was only, 6 weeks ago. Since the beginning of the LGBTQ movement, trans feminine spectrum persons have been excluded in many ways from reform projects, from legal protections, and so on. They've also been victims of systemic, structural, physical, and physical violence. And so, if elected, what would your party do to address specifically the issues that face trans feminine women? And Tom, will start with you.
Thank you. My office is right next to the mural. I actually look at it every day, and this is unbelievable, to be honest with you. And I mean, there's still an underlying. I'm going to answer the question, by the way, but I just want to make a comment about this. This is symptomatic of a lot of progress has been made. A lot of education has gone on. A lot of progress has been made. However, there's still an underlying redneckness around it that cannot stand to see that kind of creativity and that kind of artwork stand on its own and have to destroy it. And that to me is still very bothersome. And I think it should be bothersome to every compassionate, caring Canadian who abhors that type of activity. So I just thought I have to say something about that. As far as the Green Party MPs would amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to explicitly include gender identity and gender expression as protected grounds for discrimination. We would amend the criminal code to include gender identity and gender expression in the hate sentencing and the hate propaganda provisions. We would repeal Section 159 of the criminal code, and we would end targeting by Canada Customs of LGBTQ bookstores and other businesses sponsored by LGBTQ business owners. We would ensure Canada advocates internationally to end state-sanctioned discrimination and violence against LGBTQ plus people. So I think that our gender identification efforts need to be put paper, certainly the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code need to be amended to address that issue.
So we would bring back Bill C-279, and whoever wins, I think we're committed to doing that. We'll do this together. And Justin Trudeau's been our leader, has been extremely supportive of trans rights, LGBTQ community. Whenever he can, he's in every Pride parade, and he's spoken out about the importance of LGBTQ rights. He signed the Trans Equality Pledge at Vancouver Pride. And I think that beyond that, you need to be working in conjunction with the province. Yasser Naqvi, I'm sure many of you know Yasser Naqvi. He's done a really good job in passing both policy but also bills that actually make a real difference. And what struck me with the mural, it's just really sad, but it's also a reminder that there are very real problems in our community, that violence is a very big issue, that if you are trans and you are Black, it is even harder. And so I think that we need to be reminded, and it also should be a call to action. So I'm someone who started an NGO just because I saw that there was an opportunity to make a difference. I saw Catherine McKenna, my namesake, she was saying, let's have this bring us together. Let's have us, we'll actually get out there, work together, show that this is really important, that we need to take action, because it's not just laws. It isn't just laws. It's actually communities coming together. It's educating the public, the broader public that may not be aware of the challenges that are faced. And it's actually, it can be something totally positive. So I'm hoping what comes out of the attention that's been placed on the Black Lives Matter mural is that the community comes together, that the broader public actually sees that there's a real problem, and then we actually take serious measures to address it. Not just in laws, but in our own personal lives to make a difference.
I had an incredible education over the years around trans rights. When I was first elected, I didn't know as much as I know now. And I got involved, and it was interesting because I got involved at a vigil that happens every year. For those who have been murdered because of their gender identity as trans. And the first year I went, there was 10 people there. It's kind of like murder missing women, frankly. And it's grown over the years, and it was that experience, along with meeting some of my constituents who were denied access to transition, for those who were going through transition. And what I found out was that if you were in the RCMP or if you were in the military, you actually had access to transition. You'd be funded to actually go through your transition. But we weren't giving that to others. And then I found out the barriers to employment, which is pretty straightforward, right? People are just prejudiced. They don't know. Sometimes it's ignorance. It's sometimes just profound prejudice. So there's a lot that we have to do. We have to provide access to transition. We have to provide health services. We have to make sure people have access to employment. Housing, we've already talked about. And yes, the things that my colleagues have said about, understanding that we have to be in this together when we see the kinds of hate that we've seen recently in our city. And, this has been a really, really rough week. We've seen 3 women hunted down and murdered. We've seen what happened on the mural. But I'll tell you something. Let us see this as the opportunity to really come together, to understand, never take these things for granted, and look for those people who are isolated. Give them the support and the love they need. But on policy, give people access to employment, give people access to health services, and give people access to transition.
Part of the debate. I apologize, we are running short on time, so I am going to have to limit the number of questions probably to 5. I'll alternate between microphones. I will ask the people who are posing questions, again, as a reminder, to pose a question directly to one candidate. I will be timing your question and asking you to keep it under a minute, and then the candidate to whom you pose the question will have a minute to respond. So
name is Sophia Cassidy, former proud president of Ghanem Mosaic, oldest and largest trans association in Canada, and also founder of Trans-Pickling, which is the largest convention in Canada. Mr. NDP,
I've called a lot of things in my life.
yes. 2 questions, and now I have 1 minute, so stop the laughing, please. So anyhow, my first question, I'm a very mathematical person, and there should be 3 chairs there.
Yeah.
Because there's reformist, alliances, and conservative. They have teamed up together to lead the country with only 30% of the people.
Yeah.
Okay? What happens now is that you guys are fighting over the 70%. All right? So, in writings that you liberals, NDP, or Green are kind of like surely losing, and some conservative, I don't put the adjective, we all know, some conservative might win. I would invite your leaders to take some sacrifices in some
Sophia, I'm
writings.
sorry, can you just post the question?
Yes. Can you tell, please? Can you write things? Can you do that? Can you play the game of sacrificing some places to make sure that those guys don't come in? Secondly,
No, I'm
please
sorry,
go for
I'm
the
going to have to
expression.
cut you off there. Paul?
Okay. Well, I think what you're saying should we cooperate. And, you know, we have said this, we would be happy to work with anyone to defeat Stephen Harper. We're on record for that. I spend every day waking hour thinking about how to do that. Trust me. And so we want to do that, but I want to just finish with this. You know, I am a solid believer in democratic reform. I was a democratic reform critic for my party before I was a foreign affairs critic. And I shepherded through our party's policy on democratic reform, and I think we need proportionality in our system so that we actually get what we want to vote. So we actually have more opinions in voting. And we can work together and have coalitions. It worked in New Zealand, it has worked in New Zealand. If anyone wants to know how this works, the Westminster model, look at New Zealand. They have had it for years, and they just had a referendum on it, and the good people of New Zealand embraced it because it works. And that simply is, you get 2 votes, vote for the member of parliament you want, the party you want, and you get 2/3 of your members elected by first past the post like we have, so you know who your member of parliament is, and the other third proportionally, so that you actually have people get to vote for what they want, and you get the expression of the people in their parliament.
Turn to the microphone on my right, and again, I'll remind you that I am going to cut you off after a minute. And please, just 1 question.
So my question is also for Paul. So domestic violence affects queer relationships at a dramatically high proportion, and I know that NDP earlier this year had sponsored a bill for a national domestic abuse plan, or a domestic abuse prevention plan, which was shut down by the Conservative government. What would you and your party do to try and bring back that bill?
Well, thank you, and we would not only bring it back, but we just announced a couple of weeks ago the funding in our funding announcements for this initiative. You know, what we just witnessed this week of, as I mentioned, 3 women being hunted down and killed, murdered, we know there were no real supports for these women when they needed it. And yes, it was partly in the criminal justice system, but the more I've read about their stories, we know that there wasn't the protection for them when they needed it. So we need to not only bring back the legislation we proposed, but we need to see the funding to support it, because without the funding, we know what will happen. I know too many shelters that have to raise funds that they really shouldn't have to raise. This should be built-in stable funding. And look at around the world in other mature democracies, particularly Scandinavian countries. It's built in, they're funded, they're robust, and we need to do that.
On my right?
Thank you. Okay, you only have a minute. Long-form census, what would you do?
Bring it back.
Brilliant.
So I can talk a little more? Long-form census, what would you do?
Which candidate to whom are you addressing?
Oh, all of them.
I know you only get to one.
Oh, Catherine.
We would bring it back.
Points to both
lot of our legislation comes from a long-form census.
Yeah, absolutely.
People that are in need, people like myself that are on 2 disabilities. How do I get my policy out there, personal policy?
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't be more right. So I ran a charitable organization. We needed to rely on the long-form census to know who we were serving. Municipalities have talked about this to find out any, significant information on Aboriginal people. I could go on and on and on. In some ways, it's kind of unfathomable that you would just one day say you're going to get rid of the long-form census, that all this data that we all rely on, it's just gone. But that did happen. In good news, because I meet a lot of statisticians or people who are just Stats Canada at the door, and I'm tearing out my hair, and they're tearing out their hair. But they say the good news is, assuming there's a new government that gets in that brings it back, you can actually, it's not perfect, but you can actually recreate a lot of the data. And so, that's what we're going to have to do. It's so stupid that we have to go do this, but it is really important because, as you say, how can you actually know what policy you're going to bring in if you do not have the evidence on which it's supposed to be based? It is so critical, as you say, you have 2 disabilities. We need to understand who's in our community. We need to, have as much information as we can so we can properly design programs, but also allocate funding on that basis. Sorry, see, look, you should have just taken my answer.
We're now to put one ahead. Okay, on my left, please.
So this would be a question for Catherine. You mentioned that supporting marginalized communities in Canada is about more than just legislation, it's about implementation, but I also believe it's also about creating opportunities for leadership and for people from those communities to really drive policy, and not just sort of be a sounding board, but also, really be in leadership positions. So how would the Liberal Party and how would you as an individual really support the creation of more space for people from LGBTQ plus communities to actually take leadership on these issues?
So, that is a really awesome question, because I think, it's easy to sort of say we're going to create programs over here and kind of throw you over there, but really we need, members of all sorts of communities, diverse communities to be out there in leadership roles, because it inspires people. Being a woman in politics, seeing other women in politics helps me because it's actually kind of tough to make the decision to run. I think, one, we've talked about having an actual youth council that would advise our leaders, so we would bring that in. Certainly diversity on that youth council, LGBTQ youth. We could certainly, include that, diversity there. I think supporting organizations that foster leadership. So I actually ran an organization called the Band Forum. If you're a young leader interested in policy, have a look at it and apply. We need to be funding organizations that are actually good at developing leaders and fostering them. And I think, we've talked about in our appointments process, so cabinet will be 50% women, men, but also diversity in cabinet and in our appointments. And our appointments will be based on merit, but they will also be based on diversity.
Thank you, Catherine. We have time for 2 more questions.
Hello, I understand this forum is predominantly to discuss issues pertinent to the LGBTQ community, but I think it's also a forum to discuss issues pertinent to minority communities and groups in general. And throughout this election process, there's a certain minority group that I haven't heard much about, and that would be Aboriginal peoples in Canada. And I would like to see if any of you would like to take the opportunity to discuss you or your party's plan to improve the quality of life for Canadian Aboriginals.
Sorry, can I just ask you to direct that to one candidate?
I really can't. I would like whoever up there is feeling a burn.
We'll do a 15-second lightning round. How about that?
Look, we have had in our party a First Nations caucus, both before we had this awesome caucus we have now, and now. And we have to show up to be able to make a difference, and you have to then reach out for people to show up. And so that's what we've done in our caucus. Romeo Sagnash is an awesome Cree leader that's in our caucus, and he's gone out and built up the community. Let me just finish by saying, we believe fundamentally that things are not going to change with our Aboriginal First Nations anyway unless we have a nation-to-nation relationship, and that has to be the basis of everything going forward.
I'll be quite quick on this, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report to Greens, it's a gift, it's an opportunity to reopen discussions about the fundamental nature of the relationship, nation to nation, between First Nations and government. And we must seize this opportunity as soon as possible to take advantage of the timing of this. It's a beautiful thing, and I think it's almost as if it descended from the gods, to be honest with you.
So, I mean, we need to rebuild a relationship of trust, but we need to, I have an inquiry into missing and Indigenous women, and that's going to be one of the first things we do. Implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, actually follow our duty to consult and accommodate when it comes to resource development. We need to properly fund education. It is unconscionable that my kids, I have 3 kids, they go to school in Ottawa Centre. If you're on a reserve, you get 2/3 of the funding per student that my kids get. That's completely wrong in a country like Canada. And there are many measures like that we can do very quickly, but we have to be committed to it. Alors, c'est une bonne question. Alors, je m'excuse, j'aurais dû parler en français. Il y a d'autres gens, je pense sûrement qu'ils sont ici en français. Mais alors, pour moi, pour mon parti, c'est quelque chose, c'est la charte, c'est les droits humains, on doit les respecter, on doit faire certain que c'est pas seulement qu'on a les droits qui respectent les droits de la communauté LGBTQ, mais aussi qu'on a la politique qui les respecte, et je vais travailler fort pour ça. Je vais travailler fort avec la communauté, avec les organisations ici à Ottawa, parce que c'est quelque chose qui me touche beaucoup.
Merci pour cette question. C'est une question pour communiquer avec tous les gens dans la circonscription en anglais, en français. Alors pour moi, c'est primordial pour communiquer dans les 2 langues officielles avec ma communication, comme dans un site web avec les communications de la publicité. Et finalement, c'est une question de rassembler la communauté francophone ici à Ottawa. Et une chose, j'ai ajouté quelque chose aujourd'hui, ça c'est une journée très spéciale parce que aujourd'hui c'est la journée pour la francophone. So, une célébration aujourd'hui et merci pour cette question.
Excusez-moi, je ne parle plus français, excusez-moi.
One final question from the mic over here.
Hi, everybody. This question is for Paul. As many of you probably know, a couple of years ago, our Supreme Court struck down in the Bedford case the laws that govern sex work in Canada. A lot of people from the LGBT community are either sex workers or were sex workers at some point in their lives. I know many sex workers, whether it's gay men who were working a social service job and couldn't make a living, trans people who wanted to pay for hormones and surgery, LGBTQ youth that were marginalized and had no other way to make money. Anyway, when the court struck down the law and said they were unconstitutional and extremely, extremely dangerous for sex workers, and then the Conservative government brought in a law which many advocates across the country agree is just as bad, if not worse, So I'm interested to know what the NDP would do to make sex work safe and decriminalized in Canada to protect not just LGBTQ people in the sex trade, but anyone who does that kind of work.
Well, thanks for the obvious would be to repeal the law that is just, it was quite ridiculous how it came forward. The lack of respect and consultation. But then we need to obviously do something better. First of all, recognize just what you laid out is that whom this affects, right? So if you're looking at the sex trade and sex trade workers, you need to understand what their lives are actually like. And in fact, just after the court decision, I met with members of our community and advocates for the sex trade and sex trade workers in my office, and I wanted to hear from them directly. And as you know, my colleague Libby Davies has done a lot of work in this area. So what we would want to replace this horrible legislation you see in front of us is with something that actually is going to protect, make sure that the rights are there, and make sure we consult. I mean, we talked about the duty to consult for Aboriginal First Nations. There was no consultation in this bill. There was, committees of Parliament should go out to make good legislation by consulting and make sure you get it right. So that's what we do, repeal the law, include rights for people who are in the sex trade, and make sure they're protected and not vulnerable.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and shave a minute off of your responses. I apologize. But all politicians in the wings are very used to this kind of thing, I'm sure. So we'll start with Tom and work our way back through, so 2 minutes.
So this is the closing?
Yes.
Okay, great, all right. Talking. In 1996, the Green Party of Canada became the first federal party to officially support the inclusion of same-sex couples in civil marriage. And we are pleased that this issue is now settled. However, much prejudice and discrimination remains, and transgender people are rarely even considered when laws and public policies have been created. Our vision is of a world free from discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. A world in which difference is accepted and celebrated. There was a radio station, a website that from Western Canada that is telling its parishioners that about each party that is running in the federal election. And about the Green Party, they said, their focus is environmental based, but when it comes to moral issues, they are very liberal in their thinking. And so you can expect more of the same from the Green Party of Canada with regard to LGBTQ issues. And when you go and vote, and when your friends ask you about this particular event, please tell them about the empty chair. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks all of you for being here tonight. It's been a great turnout, some really important issues that often aren't discussed in our community and definitely not in Parliament enough. As I mentioned earlier, it's been a tough week. We've had 3 women murdered. We've had the defacing of a mural that was an expression, hopefully, of love and understanding and education. And it was then, of course, transgressed yet again, even after people tried to deal with that. This is really disturbing, and we do have to understand that we have to reach out to each other to find a better way to live amongst each other and understand each other better. And that means people taking leadership steps. And that means each of us in this room doing that. So when we see discrimination happen, regardless of a person's gender or race or status or income, we need to say it's wrong when we're seeing them discriminated and look towards how we can make it different. I think that the issues that we've talked tonight are expressed often. The slut walk this year was great. I went out and I saw a great group of people coming together to raise awareness. I saw a huge crowd go yesterday and take back the night at a very important time in our right now what's happening in our community. And so what you're doing tonight is yet another expression. So when we see people who are basing their opinions on ignorance, or they are basing their opinions and actions on hate, we need to show them that together we are going to stand up and defeat those who are haters, those who are discriminating, and make sure that we look open and love each other in a way that is acceptable for all of us to thrive. Finally, I just want to say, if we understand the problems, then we are going to understand the solutions, and I look forward to working on those with you going forward.
Final word goes to you.
Alors, c'était une journée très importante. Alors, pour celui en derrière, je vais essayer de parler un peu plus en français, c'est un peu difficile, mais je vais essayer. Alors, je pense que c'est une tellement importante discussion aussi. On a touché sur les droits des personnes LGBTQ dans une plus grande contexte. I think it's really important that we look at these issues from a broader context. I did a debate that was with Paul actually, and it was looking at, what would a feminist foreign policy look like? But we need to be looking at policies from a whole variety of different angles. So, what would a policy look like if you were looking at from the lens of LGBTQ community? Because I think what happens is we often make laws, we often make policies without considering the real impact on people. And I think that that's just really critical, and it's come out here when we've talked about poverty, when we've talked about sex workers, when we've talked about so many issues that are interrelated, and we have some more sophisticated way of addressing these issues. I will say this is a really important election. I'm proud to be running because I think that we absolutely need a change of government. And I'm just going to be clear, that sounds maybe partisan, but we absolutely do. We don't need an empty chair. We need to make progress on so many issues instead of going backwards. And I think, you've got good choices here. The Liberal Party has a strong record on charter rights, and that's why I'm a Liberal. Partly I'm a Liberal because I really believe in the progress we've made, and I'm certainly committed to us making greater progress and working together with all parties to make a real difference. Because, this is about our country. As I said, this is about who we are. This is about who we want to be. It's about us working together to tackle the problems, to improve lives for everyone in our community, and I really mean everyone. And there are people who are really suffering in our community for a variety of reasons. And so I think that you have a real opportunity to make a difference. So please, whatever you do, consider voting for me, but please, more importantly, get out and vote.
That draws this evening's debate to a close. I just want to thank again the sponsor.